truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Friday, May 10th, 2024, the 1,206th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription on Substack at imyourmoderator.substack.com. When you become a paid subscriber, you will get the show with an ad-free experience and enable yourself to participate in the conversation on Substack and join the interactive live streams each and every Wednesday. You can do so for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will be supporting me, the work I do, and this show as it expands. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on a wide variety of podcast platforms. And of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'm your moderator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company, and that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. So each and every week, it seems like the panic just increases and intensifies. And so we're going to have some fun with a little bit of panic to start off the show. We will get into some serious panic at the end of the show. And then in the meantime, we'll just talk about what's happening in the world. Let's begin with MSNBC's Stephanie Ruhle, who's talking to Mark McKinnon, the little man who dresses like a flamboyantly gay cowboy and was previously one of the stars of Showtime's The Circus. If you've been listening for a while, we had a wonderful send-off episode after The Circus broadcast its series finale, and sitting alongside is this very odd woman named Molly Jong-Fast, who is a quote-unquote journalist, essentially just a product of nepotism, who spent all of the very deadly pandemic huddled in a corner in her New York apartment, not coming out for months and months and months for any reason, and dutifully telling the rest of the world how they should be doing the same. But here we go, Mark McKinnon.
Delay. In Florida, delayed indefinitely. Now, Georgia, it has been a rough few days for Jack Smith and Fani Willis. Mark, do you think we are going to see any progress here before the election and after the election? Do you think these trials are ever going to happen?
Well, I don't know. But I mean, the key question is anything going to happen before the election? And I think the answer is no. The days of magical legal thinking are over. The cavalry is not coming. The legal cavalry is not coming to the rescue of Joe Biden.
The legal cavalry is not coming to the rescue of Joe Biden. He is not even being shy about what the intent of all of this was. It was to affect the election. That's the real question, he says. Will any of this happen before the election? The answer is no. The years of magical legal thinking have ended. All of this has, of course, been a charade the entire time, but the charade, too, has not worked. CNN.com had a piece on their front page yesterday with the headline, "Wait, why are 3 of Trump's 4 criminal trials delayed indefinitely?" The CNN writer, in a daring and bold attempt to polish this narrative turd, determined that his approach would be that the fact these trials are being delayed means that Donald Trump was wrong in calling them all a political persecution and a conspiracy to interfere with the 2024 election. You see, because the plot didn't work, that means it was never a plot. Zachary B. Wolf wrote, "If Trump could manufacture a conspiracy theory out of the fact that separate grand juries in New York, Florida, Georgia, and Washington, D.C. all independently approved charges against him, what would he make of the following series of events?" And so Wolf clearly thinks that all of his readers will believe, oh yeah, 4 compromised courts, that could never happen. They couldn't all be in on it. All of these writers consistently coming from the same perspective that despite not knowing any of the underlying facts of any of these cases, there must actually be underlying facts that support these cases. And regardless, Donald Trump is certainly guilty. Wolf explains from his perspective in the simplest possible terms for all of the child brains who will read this, that the cases are delayed because of Donald Trump's strategy to delay the cases being effective. So it's actually just Donald Trump with the interference strategy, and the courts can't be compromised because they are actually doing him favors. He concludes this way. The point here is that for all of Trump's controversial actions as president and his clear attempt to change election results, a conviction for falsifying business records, if it even comes, may not be what sways those few voters in swing states who will decide this election. Trump's prosecutions are no grand conspiracy of election interference. They're part of a slow-working justice system in which it helps to have the resources, thanks to donors, to pay an army of lawyers who can gum up the works. Trump's long-standing strategy is to delay his trials, get elected, and then work to make them go away. From that perspective, this has been a good week for him. And this is obviously the height of Trump derangement. We're going to go through a few examples of that. But the idea that Donald Trump is manipulating the system to delay his trials, and therefore Trump's opponents are not getting a fair shake, the American people are not getting justice, that's quite a conspiracy theory. Let's go to frequent Morning Joe guest, MSNBC staple for like 2 decades now, Mike Barnicle, a man who used to be a columnist at the Boston Globe until he parted ways with that newspaper for plagiarizing and lying over and over and over again. It's good to know that no matter how dishonest you are as a journalist, how little integrity you have, whatever political scandals you may have involved yourself in as a politician or an intelligence asset or former law enforcement, you will always be welcome on MSNBC. I mean, Joe Scarborough might have murdered a staffer when he was a congressman. I mean, I know that's a conspiracy theory, but also, I mean, she is dead. But here's Mike Barnicle.
Donald Trump is a phenomenon that's not going away. And I'm wondering when the Democratic Party is going to figure out, you know, you can make fun of him, you can talk about him being on trial and everything like that. He's not going away. None of this seems to be damaging him with the core of his support.
No, and you look at Wisconsin, and that is just absolutely ground zero for probably the state of the three most important states where this election is going to be decided. And the polling, the recent polling is so close that it just shows how this election is going to be such a nail biter and really subject to what crazy event is going to happen and ultimately shake it in one direction or the other over the next 6 months.
He's a phenomenon that's not going away. Well, yeah, of course he's not going away, because every day it becomes more clear that he's the guy exposing the problems, not the guy causing the problems. And I have no idea who that wacky little woman who jumped in after Mike Barnicle is, but if she thinks that polls are close in Wisconsin, she's nuts. The Uniparty side is trying to pretend like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania are strong blue states. That's their blue wall. But even as fake and skewed in his direction as the polls are, Joe Biden is losing in all of those states consistently and losing massively across the country. And we're still nearly 6 months away from the election. Aside from the polls' fakeness, which is obvious, the polls are still even closer than they should be because of the presence of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and some of the other third-party candidates, irrelevant though they may be. RFK Jr. the other day said that he had brain worms eating his brain, which is about the only thing I've ever seen that could possibly come close to Joe Biden thinking that his Uncle Bosie was eaten by cannibals. RFK Jr. is not going to pose any sort of long-term threat to Donald Trump. And to be fair, I'm kind of glad that RFK Jr. brought up the idea of parasites that could get into your brain. It seems to me to be part of the same info op that the Cuomo brothers are on board with now. Chris Cuomo the other day talked about how he's having all of these negative vaccine-related quote-unquote side effects, and he's taking ivermectin. Ivermectin obviously being an extraordinarily effective anti-parasitic. His brother, Andrew Cuomo, the former governor of New York, disgraced into resignation from a semi-serious sex scandal, though he should be far more concerned about his COVID policies and putting people into nursing homes, considering his financial relationships with those nursing homes. But he came out on a show with the crisis actor and COVID central narrative purveyor, Leanna Wen, to claim that the government actually wasn't enforcing any of those COVID policies. No one had to follow any of them. And basically, people just did that by choice. Now, he's lying, of course, because the state was putting pressures on people in a whole range of ways. But leaving that aside, the fact that this clip is going viral and that a former governor is saying they had no means of enforcement for any of this should teach people the lesson that their best bet is to never, ever comply. So that message being spread at the same time, there are some ivermectin commercials going viral within the central narrative. That seems to me to be a pretty effective, coordinated info op. Time to coincide with these stories about the WHO pandemic treaty and new claims that 1 in 4 Americans is going to be killed by the H5N1 bird flu. So on one side, we're getting the very deadly pandemic, very scary variant narrative. And on the other side, we're getting the, hey, vaccines don't work, ivermectin does, and oh yeah, the state can't enforce any of this narratives. But the idea that Wisconsin is going to potentially go for Joe Biden and that this election is going to be a nail biter, that's all nonsense. The creepiest part of this clip actually is when she talks about some major event that is going to swing everything one way or another. That's something I've been talking about for months, if not years. They want to get everybody back on the same page. They will continue to try to create events that would have the potential to do that. All of them on some level will either be fake or false flags. And it's really just a matter of whether or not people are prepared to step up and allow people to call them mean while they say, yeah, sorry, that's fake. I'm not going to get on board with that. Not at all. We'll pass on that. Next pandemic, pass. George Floyd, pass. MAGA extremist violence, pass. School shooting, sorry, pass. War on foreign soil, pass. War on American soil, pass. Nuclear war on American soil, pass. Presidential assassination attempt, pass. Alien invasion, pass. And if we can make our way through all of those things and maybe a couple days of a power outage, I think we're going to be all right. Now, although the polls are fake and they always skew in the Uniparty's favor, they can still provide a great deal of entertainment, a great deal of narrative power, and of course, they provoke all of these standard issue villagers on the Uniparty left into live public brain aneurysms and complete and total meltdowns.
Another thing interesting in this polling was more independents said that they worry about President Biden weakening democracy than Trump, 53% to 42%. What do you make of this?
I find it shocking, honestly. I can't, make sense of that number. I wish I could. I wish I had some really great insight to it. But I don't know if it's an outlier or not, because the other numbers with independents and Biden are going in the right direction. So that may be it. But also, just one thing I wanted to add on to what Basil said. This trial's not on TV. You guys do a great job reporting what's happening. But if there aren't those images coming out of the courthouse, people feel like they know this story. We've heard about it for a long time. So it doesn't surprise me that they're not interested.
So that's some lady named Susan Del Percio who is confused by the numbers in this new PBS NewsHour NPR Marist poll that suggest 53% of independents believe Joe Biden will do more than Donald Trump to weaken our democracy. So the claim above all other claims that Donald Trump is going to destroy our democracy, among independents, they are rejecting that claim, believing that Joe Biden is a far worse danger to, quote unquote, our democracy. She has no idea what to make of that, so she simply changes the subject and then agrees that all of these trials are failing spectacularly. Her explanation is that the Stormy Daniels trial isn't on TV. And this is one of those moments where you wonder, is she just executing a script on our behalf? Is she trying to convince the Uniparty and the regime that their best bet is to televise these trials because that's the only way to actually make Donald Trump look bad throughout this process? Please, by all means, televise them. Make it so much worse on yourselves. She is absolutely correct in her understanding that this story is 7 years old. And everyone already knows the story. Everyone knows there's nothing there. And most people by now are realizing that Stormy Daniels, too, says there was never any affair in the first place. Donald Trump is being shown to be a victim throughout this process. It just keeps getting worse. So the new stuff's not working. The old stuff's not working. You got to bring in your big guns. And there is no bigger gun on that side than Hillary Clinton. So they think, hey, let's bring Hillary on to call Donald Trump and his supporters names again. That'll do it.
The world has been here before. People did not take the kind of threats that we saw in the 1930s as seriously as they should, including American journalists. You know, people were taking at face value that, oh, this can be controlled. He may have said some outrageous things, but, you know, the institutions will hold. A determined demagogue, unfortunately supported by members of his political party, other enablers, people who care more about a future tax cut than the sanctity of the Constitution, are falling in line behind him.
Now, it's worth noting that the father of Hillary Clinton's eye bags and her political career, and maybe Hillary Clinton herself, but don't repeat that because that is a conspiracy theory, George Soros, is himself an admitted Nazi collaborator. That's not a conspiracy theory. He said it on 60 Minutes. But Donald Trump is Hitler again. We are in 1930s Germany. We've all said never again, but now it's happening again. And it's all Donald Trump's fault. It's all the fault of those MAGA extremists. And Donald Trump is now in the process of turning all Americans into MAGA extremists, which means that they're all his Nazi followers. And it's all happening again. And that is what they are going to try to pitch to the American public. There's no way they're going to convince the country that Joe Biden could possibly ever win an election over Donald Trump. So instead, they're going to have to go back to the old playbook for when things get really, really bad. Is anyone going to buy it? No, of course not, because they have destroyed their credibility about absolutely everything, including the Nazis. I mean, how do you go from having that as your, no pun intended, pardon me, trump card to destroying your trump card before you ever get to use it? That's like the biggest weapon in the arsenal. That's bigger than fake alien invasion. And they're finding a way to blow it. And let's just take a small tangent for a second. Think about informational timelines here. From the perspective of people who actually make the decisions on how this world operates. People think the Clintons and Obamas are bad. They're the puppet masters. They're the ones holding and taking advantage of everyone's compromise. I'm talking about levels up above them, but I suppose you could include them too. These are people who look years ahead, decades ahead, centuries ahead, sometimes further ahead than that. In order to plan things out, they know exactly what moves will be made, exactly what they'll be able to accomplish. They are setting the agenda and leveraging things so that they can be sure the agenda will be implemented. Does it even make sense to think they don't know what's going to happen in November, 6 months from now, regarding the American election? Knowing for an indisputable fact that they have been choosing the winners of elections not only in America, but in countries around the world for decades, if not all time. Should we really pretend that they are operating on the same informational timeline we are? They're preparing for events and circumstances well beyond the November 5th, 2024 scheduled American election. The results of that election and what plays out after are, in some sense, already baked into the cake from their perspective. We don't need to be focused on making sure that Donald Trump is more popular than Joe Biden in 6 months. Donald Trump has been more popular than Joe Biden for the entire time, 4 years, including the 2020 election. We can simply allow that to take shape just based on the progress and momentum in that direction, knowing that it can't be turned around without one of those big, jarring potential events. And if and when one of those arises, we'll just defeat that too. What we should be preparing for is the narrative attack that will be launched after that, which is Donald Trump is Hitler, all his supporters are Nazis, and therefore we are justified in using state force, if not international force, against them. And as I said the other day, sure, okay, that sounds scary. The way to make sure it doesn't happen is for everybody to understand what the angle is well in advance. And that's exactly what we're doing. Hillary Clinton should be mocked for saying this at every turn. Every time someone talks about Donald Trump being Hitler, laugh in their faces and point out that it was just a few months ago they were supporting Nazi battalions. Again, it's not going to work because these people have no credibility. They have no credibility because we've been able to convincingly point out that everything they're saying is bullshit. The news stories they rely on to build the false reality where they are popular and good have been shown clearly to be fake. And because of all that, they are now subject to relentless, effective mocking, because all of it has gone way past the point of being simply political dirty tricks or some underhanded tactics in a campaign. It is pure evil. And the fact that people can detect the propaganda and they experience the censorship leads them to understand exactly what sort of evil this is. Now, James Carville, who was a former Clinton advisor and now just a media hack, also was interviewed in the series finale of Showtime's The Circus. Despite how malicious and utterly retarded he is, still happens to be one of their best analysts and strategists. He's one of those guys that treats the whole thing as some kind of blood sport. He just cares about winning and defeating his Republican opponents and has been doing this round by round, year by year, for decade after decade. He likes arguing at cocktail parties and being called smart on television. He likes to be some kind of sage, some kind of oracle. They all come to James Carville for the wisdom. And now even James Carville is panicking.
And Trump's more ahead than he's ever been. Fewer people think January 6th was any kind of what it was, as an assault on the temple of democracy, the Constitution. I don't know whatever the fuck you want to say. It's going the wrong way. It's not working. Everything that we're throwing is spaghetti at a wall, and none of it is sticking, me included. And it's hard when you start in your 80th year, and you know, like anybody else, I have an opinion of myself, and the opinion I've come to is I don't matter. It doesn't matter. You can prepare. You can be on TV. Or you can write pieces. You can have a YouTube channel. You can have a podcast. And nothing. And, you know, we got to try to think of something different, because what we're doing is really, really not working.
What we're doing is really, really not working. We've got to think of something. James Carville has realized that he doesn't matter, that none of them matter. They can throw all the spaghetti they can come up with against that wall, and none of it is sticking because none of it is real. That's the reason. It's not real. It's not based in fact. They can't make their arguments because their arguments are not based in reality prime. All of their arguments are effective only in the false reality. If you are not experiencing an inversion within the false reality, their arguments mean nothing. You can see it in their eyes. You can hear it in the tone of their voices. Every instinct you have should tell you these people are lying. These people don't know what they're talking about. They are full of hate. They lie all the time. They don't know anything. Their predictions never come true. They rely on emotion and slander. And to back all of that up, they are willing to use all of the power of that old guard system, from the media to the political parties to academia to corporate influence to propaganda to censorship to wars to immigration to claims of racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, transphobia, all of it. They sow discord in communities. They destabilize populations. It still doesn't work because no one believes them anymore. They have lost all their credibility. They are now only targets for mocking and ridicule. The only people who buy into any of it anymore are people like them, or people who are so apathetic and detached that they have completely checked out now for years. Their source of news is headlines prepared for them that pop up as notifications on the screen of their phone. Articles they don't even read, just the headlines. The headlines give them an impression of how things are, and that's enough. And I actually have a perfect example of that phenomenon to lead us into a different part of our conversation. Imagine you're an average standard issue villager out there. You don't really pay attention to the news at all, but you see some headlines, you see some perspectives on social media, some celebrities or athletes you follow, maybe a little Joy Reid or Rachel Maddow or Jesse Waters or Mark Levin. And you know you're not an expert on anything, but you feel like you have an idea of what's happening. And then you get this headline on your phone. Appeals court upholds Steve Bannon's contempt of Congress conviction for defying January 6th subpoena. And you think to yourself, yeah, I figured that was going to happen. Everybody knows there was a very violent insurrection. I mean, the type of person I'm talking about definitely hasn't followed along enough to know that that too was a false flag and a hoax. They certainly don't know that the sham January 6th committee was not properly formed according to congressional rules and constitutes nothing more than a primetime television show that they admit was designed to convince people to believe the very violent insurrection narrative, since it was obviously going to fall apart, since the story they told was complete and total bullshit. So, of course, they think the committee is legitimate, which would make their subpoenas legitimate, which means that Steve Bannon has to respond to their subpoenas. And because of all that, Steve Bannon is not the target of a grave injustice. He is a criminal who is helping Donald Trump overturn the results of a free and fair election. And so when an appeals court upholds a lower court's decision to send Steve Bannon to jail for not responding to the sham committee's subpoena, well, that just means Steve Bannon's extra guilty. That is what actually happens in the brain of a standard issue villager whose sense of what is happening in the world is composed only of headlines selected for them by a news aggregator like Apple News, for instance, designed to target them specifically with the headlines it is determined they should see. And to adopt that belief is to be completely and exactly wrong about everything that matters in this story. And so let's go through it because it's a short one. A federal appeals court on Friday upheld the contempt of Congress conviction of Steve Bannon, ex-advisor to former President Donald Trump, who was found guilty after failing to comply with a subpoena from the House January 6th committee. Bannon's conviction, and now the D.C. Circuit's affirmation of that conviction, is a boost to Congress's leverage in its efforts going forward to obtain cooperation in its investigations. Now that is a very strange way of framing that. Shouldn't this decision be a confirmation that everyone is subject to the same set of laws and that justice will be meted out equally no matter who is accused? Nope. It's just a boost in Congress's ability to enforce subpoenas in the future. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, by the way, is not a corrupt institution in an international city-state that constitutes one of the global empire's world capitals, though we pretend it's the seat of a government of, by, and for the people. Nor is it a legitimate court who's adjudicating legal issues. It is the final say on Steve Bannon's ultimate guilt. Except that it's not. Let's continue. The U.S. D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals unanimously rejected several challenges Bannon made to the case, including his claim that the trial court excluded evidence he should have been allowed to put before the jury in his defense. Bannon was sentenced to 4 months in federal prison, and that sentence was also upheld Friday by the appeals court. The ruling could pave the way for Bannon to eventually report to prison, though the timing is unclear. The judge who presided over Bannon's trial previously agreed to let him hold off from serving his sentence while his appeal played out. In its ruling Friday, the 3-judge appeals panel gave Bannon time to appeal its ruling to the full D.C.-based appeals court before it formally notifies the trial judge that the conviction was upheld. Bannon could also turn directly to the Supreme Court for additional appeals, possibly further delaying when he needs to start serving his prison term. In the D.C. Circuit Court's new ruling, Judge Bradley Garcia, an appointee of President Joe Biden, backed the trial judge's exclusion of an advice of counsel defense, as Bannon had claimed he had rebuffed the subpoena because of supposed executive privilege concerns expressed to him by his lawyer. This exact advice of counsel defense is no defense at all, Garcia wrote, noting that the contempt law only required proof that Bannon, quote, deliberately and intentionally, end quote, did not respond to the subpoena. His opinion was joined by Judge Cornelia Pillard, an appointee of former President Barack Obama, and Trump-appointed Judge Justin Walker. The appeals court noted that, quote, the communications from former President Trump's counsel, end quote, that Bannon had tried to rely on to defend his conduct did not purport, quote, to authorize Bannon's refusal to produce any documents or appear for his deposition, end quote. The D.C. Circuit also rejected Bannon's argument that the House Select Committee that investigated the January 6th insurrection was improperly formed. These objections suffer from a common defect, the judges wrote. Bannon did not raise them before the Select Committee and therefore forfeited them. They go on to give some more of the backstory about how Steve Bannon was a very, very bad boy on January 6th, and he was very uncooperative. And of course, they also mentioned the fact that Peter Navarro is reported to be serving his 4-month jail sentence for similarly failing to obey orders from the sham January 6th committee. Now, hopefully, Steve Bannon will appeal and win on appeal. Every step in this process has been part of the same sham and same hoax. The idea that an American would have to spend a second in prison for any of this is absolutely disgraceful, especially Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro. These are members of the Uniparty's political opposition. These are clearly political persecutions. They're going after both of them because they didn't help the Uniparty with one of its other political persecutions. And you have to understand, they would love to get Steve Bannon off the air for 4 months, especially around election time, and maybe even more than before the election. They would want him off the air after the election. So we will see how that process plays out. Now, there's some interesting news from African neighbors Chad and Niger. We spent some time on both a couple of weeks ago as various U.S. military installments are leaving these countries to be replaced by Russian military. The U.S. and Russia were actually at one of those bases at the same time, leading people to wonder, hey, if the U.S. and Russian militaries are sharing a base right now, does that mean that whole war in Ukraine is fake? And of course, the answer to that is, yeah. How did you just figure that out right now? But we talked a couple of weeks ago about how the illegitimate Biden administration, their State Department, was trying to make it so that the U.S. military could keep its presence in both countries. They were negotiating, hoping that after the elections, they might have more leverage. And we talked a bit about the elections in Chad. If you want to listen to that episode, it's called Total Chad. Well, that election has now been held, and the New York Times needs to set the narrative. Chad's military ruler is announced as winner of disputed election. So there we have it. Basically, Chad has endured a military coup, and the New York Times wants us to know that their leadership is totally illegitimate. So whatever we as America and as the global regime, whatever we do is totally justified. Because what's happening there? Oh, it's just totally unfair. Celebratory gunshots rang out in the capital of the Central African nation of Chad on Thursday night after its military ruler, President Mahamat Idris Deby, was declared the winner of a highly scripted presidential election on national television. And that, my friends, is a WTF of a paragraph. Gotta love that they start out immediately with celebratory gunshots. You see, this military ruler and his supporters, basically terrorists. No, it's not racist if they oppose the regime. It's only racist when you frame Black or African regime supporters with discrediting stereotypes. And a highly scripted presidential election? Are they trying to destroy Chad's democracy? Chad is not going to like that. 2 hours before the official broadcast, a quote-unquote resounding victory had been claimed by his main challenger, Success Masra, the opposition leader who has been the country's prime minister since January after he returned from exile abroad and made a deal with Mr. Deby. But the preliminary results announced by Chad's National Elections Management Agency depicted a resounding victory for the other side. Mr. Deby, it said, won by 61% of the vote and Mr. Masra 18.5%. So not even close, according to the National Elections Management Agency. Many analysts saw the result of Chad's election as a foregone conclusion, and one that had been masterminded by a supposedly transitional government that never had any intention of relinquishing power. Mr. Deby, who took power after his father and predecessor Idris Deby Itno died on the battlefield in 2021, had promised not to run for election, but he did. And against a field that was reduced in number by the disqualification of several prominent candidates and the shooting death of another 2 months before the vote. One of a strip of countries in Africa's arid Sahel region ruled by a military junta after a coup. The landlocked nation of roughly 18 million people has never had a free and fair election. Oh man, they are missing out. Civil society groups, opposition members, and some election observers condemned violence and fraud in Monday's election, and there were allegations of ballot box stuffing. In a live broadcast on his Facebook page, Mr. Masra called upon his supporters to, quote-unquote, mobilize peacefully. You already know the results of this election because they're your results, he said, reading from a tablet, a Chadian flag behind him. You have voted for change. But anyone venturing into the streets of N'Djamena, the capital, on Thursday night was met with a military presence that was heavily armed, unusually so even for Chad. 18 months ago, dozens of protesters were killed as they demanded change during demonstrations set off by the junta's decision to extend its stay in power. Now, the dynamics are a bit confusing here. The loser claimed victory before any of the votes were in. And then once they came in, he got completely destroyed. Well, now he's calling for peaceful protests, and who knows what that might spark. The New York Times, the regime in general, based on the coverage from a couple weeks ago and this coverage right here, seems to be against Deby, the so-called military ruler. You hear how they describe the military junta governments of these other African nations in the Sahel who seem to have kicked out the global regime from their countries. If nothing else, at least the U.S. has left. And it's worth noting, by the way, that they did that under the fake president, Joe Biden. But that certainly isn't Joe Biden's agenda. That's Donald Trump's agenda. How is Donald Trump's agenda being implemented in so many different ways during Joe Biden's very real presidency? Gosh, there's just no explanation anywhere for something like that. Except, of course, there is. It's called devolution. So is Joe Biden just totally incompetent, completely feckless, looked at as a joke around the world? Or is Donald Trump in full control? Or is it both? And are those basically the same? But let's keep going. Let's see how Reuters covers it. This is from yesterday, May 9th. Chad declares interim President Deby winner of disputed vote. So Reuters and the New York Times are both telling you right out front, right in the headline, that they're not certain, but they think that there's at least some chance that maybe there's something a little off about these numbers. It's not like when Joe Biden received 81 million real lawful American votes and all the headlines say Donald Trump's false claims, Donald Trump's baseless claims, election fraud claims with no evidence in all the headlines. Joe Biden, you remember, won by the most votes of all time ever, and there was no dispute, at least not in the headlines. Anytime there was, that dispute was false and baseless and dangerous. In fact, it compromised our very democracy, and it led to an attack on the citadel of our democracy. But let's go to Reuters. Chad's state election body said on Thursday, interim President Mahamat Idris Deby had won the May 6th presidential election outright with over 61% of the vote, citing provisional results even as his main challenger declared himself the winner. Chad's junta has become the first of the coup-hit countries in West and Central Africa to stage a return to constitutional rule via the ballot box, but some opposition parties have cried foul over vote rigging concerns. And by the way, you are getting a look right here at our future, assuming we still have elections to come in our future. I think there's at least a small chance that we will never have another election. And not because someone's going to take over the country and never relinquish control, but because the governmental systems of the regime that they have spread throughout the world that they call our democracy, eventually to turn into fascism and communism, because that is literally their agenda, that's all obsolete. It doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work with this kind of communication, this kind of interconnectivity. It's possible that any system of government that we have ever learned about or understood is simply obsolete at this point. We're not going to get into that right now, but it's something we have to begin thinking about. But back to the article. With tensions running high, large numbers of security forces deployed at major intersections in the capital, N'Djamena, ahead of the results announcement. So they had military in the streets for the announcement of the results of their election. National Election Management Agency Chief Ahmed Bardeshe said Deby had secured 61.3% of the vote, comfortably over the 50% needed to avoid a runoff. And in so many of these foreign elections that we have discussed over the past few years, they always have this system to provide for a runoff where they'll allow for the legitimately popular candidate to win in the first round, but not exceed 50%, and then lose by a very small margin in the runoff due to some major event that happened that turned the tides. It is an old play in an old playbook that they use over and over again in cycles around the world on slightly different timelines. The fact that we can observe all of these things happening repeatedly throughout the world means that we need to understand that this is a scripted series of events that is intended to go a certain way for a certain reason. If that reason is exposed prior to people's observation of the events, then they are able to see the events for what they are, which means they don't get caught in the emotional outbursts in the aftermath of a reported election result, of violence in the streets, of false flag events. None of that can affect them because they know that's coming. They know it's coming because they know the playbook, they know the strategy, they know the course of events. This is how we make these things stop in the real world, and they have to stop, which is why you talk about the playbook in advance, and when they implement each step in that playbook, you point at it and say, hey, that's fake. They're doing it for this reason, and then mock anyone who just falls for the nonsense. It works every time because these people do not have truth on their side. What they say can never correspond to reality prime. And as long as you are connected and understand what's coming, you're going to be ahead of all of this. This is why James Carville is having a meltdown, because none of it works anymore. It's not just Donald Trump. It's everywhere. It doesn't work anymore. This is what it means to lose control over the means of information. And people commonly understand that the heart of communism, ideologically speaking, is control over the means of production. Everything is owned by the state because the state is portrayed as the proxy of the people collectively. They all have an equal share in what the state is doing because it's our democracy. Now, I suppose there would be an interesting argument on which one is more important, control over the means of production or control over the means of information. But if you ask me, hands down, it's control over the means of information. because people can get resourceful and make do. If the entirety of the means of production was seized from the American people, but the American people were all interconnected and understood what was happening and could communicate, all the leverage resides with the informed populace who would have to go buy those goods in order to keep the means of production going. And the corrupt and illegitimate communist state would have to be able to protect all of that. That seems extraordinarily unlikely in a situation where people in a decentralized fashion control the means of information. But back to the article, the Elections Management Agency chief said Debbie avoided a runoff with 61%. He said Debbie's prime minister and top opposition candidate, Success Masra, 40, had won 18.53%. Just before the ceremony, Masra claimed victory in a live broadcast on Facebook and called on security forces and his supporters to oppose what he called an attempt to steal the vote. Imagine that on election day, calling on his supporters and quote-unquote security forces, which sounds a lot like private military. And again, I'm not from Chad. Maybe there is a twist on this story I'm not getting, but one way or another, we are being told that a quote-unquote presidential candidate is asking for private military forces to help make sure that he is the quote-unquote winner of the election. And so let's think about that scenario relative to our coming election. Let's say it's 4 p.m. Eastern time on election day, and the fake president Joe Biden comes out and says, due to the 6 weeks of early voting and this election day turnout, we can now project that I have won re-election. I hope my supporters go out there to celebrate very peacefully and very carefully. And I call on the CIA and MS-13 and all those foreign military-aged men who came in across our southern border to go out there and let everyone know that Joe Biden won the 2024 election. Now, that would probably be quite scary at first, but then we'd be like, oh, wait, it's Joe Biden. Nothing's going to happen. It occurs to me, by the way, that one of the reasons Trump may still give some support to this whole early voting farce is that the Uniparty intends to have some of that early voting and then at whatever point make it impossible to have an election day. And of course, after that, they would try to convince the country that Joe Biden has been reelected due to this massive early vote that's been cast. Again, sounds doomy, but there's no reason to be scared because it's Joe Biden. That's never going to work. These people already know they've lost and no one believes them. Now think about what it would be like if Donald Trump came out. Before the reporting of the votes began to come in, he declared himself the winner and then asked his supporters and the military to go out and protect his win. You couldn't even imagine him doing that, right? Not because he wouldn't know that he won already. Everybody will have known that Donald Trump won already. Why wouldn't you let the votes come in first and allow the country to see it all for themselves? Doing it preemptively seems desperate. It seems like something someone would do if they know they're not going to win. But back to the article. A small number of individuals believe they can make people believe that the election was won by the same system that has been ruling Chad for decades, he said, and this is Masra. To all Chadians who voted for change, who voted for me, I say, mobilize. Do it calmly with a spirit of peace, he said. What happens next is unclear. Now, just think about how Reuters is portraying his comments. He is a strong, confident leader who is asking his people to make their voices heard peacefully and patriotically. Oh, wait, that's what Trump did right before he staged an insurrection. This is the mainstream media making it clear that it's okay when their guys do it. And I have to say that so far, everything leads me to believe that this is their guy. The disputed results cap a fraught electoral period marked by the killing of opposition figure Yahya Dillo. the rejection of prominent opposition figures from the candidate list, and other issues that critics say have compromised the credibility of the process. While Masra drew larger than expected crowds on the campaign trail, analysts had widely predicted that the victor would be Deby, who seized power when rebels killed his long-ruling father, Idris Deby, in April 2021. And that's weird. The New York Times said his father was killed on the battlefield. But Reuters said that Masra drew larger than expected crowds. Now that sounds like big crowds. It sounds almost Trumpian. But are they larger than Deby's crowds or just larger than expected? If 250 people showed up of their own accord to a Joe Biden event, that would be a larger crowd than expected, but it's not a larger crowd than Donald Trump. Post-election protests are possible, though the threat of police repression could dissuade many people from taking to the streets. Crisis group experts said ahead of the vote, and they have capitalized both crisis and group, so I assume this is some sort of organization that organizes crises. The election is being closely watched from abroad, while other juntas in the insurgency-torn Sahel region, including Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, have told Paris and other Western powers to withdraw and turn to Moscow for support. Chad remains the last Sahel state with a substantial French military presence. Hey, remember how you guys were waiting for the election? Well, bye now. Security and the economy have been key campaign issues. One of the world's least developed countries, Chad's meager resources have been stretched thinner by multiple shocks, including climate change-fueled heat waves and a refugee crisis linked to the civil war in Sudan. So you see that when you don't play along with the regime is going to decimate your country in any way it can, and it will continue its destabilization policies through climate change and unwanted mass migration. All they have to do is start another problem next door that solves one of their problems, and then they can send everyone over. It's important to understand that when the regime has its claws deep into a country, when they have full control, they don't describe the country as a terrible place. They don't describe it as impoverished. They say it's blooming and blossoming. All of this money is flooding in for new businesses to take advantage of this or that booming market. You're supposed to be sold on the idea that Chad is a terrible place, and it's because it's been ruled by the Deby family. But let's shift from the global regime perspective to the Russian perspective and hopefully the perspective of the people of Chad. Now, we have no way of knowing if from this Russian-aligned resource, Sputnik Africa, we are going to get the legitimate view of the people of Chad, but it should provide us a different perspective than what we've gotten from the New York Times and Reuters. Chad's interim leader, Deby, wins election with 61.3%, preliminary results show. Compare that headline to the ones we just read. The New York Times again, Chad's military ruler is announced as winner of disputed election. Reuters, Chad declares interim President Deby winner of disputed vote. So both of those headlines depict Deby as somehow illegitimate, the leader of a military junta who is assuming power on disputed results, and Sputnik Africa just says he won by a lot. On Monday, Chad held presidential elections where more than 8.2 million registered voters had a chance to choose the next head of state. These elections will end a 3-year transition period, which began after the death on the battlefield of the then president of Chad, Idris Deby Itno. So they say battlefield too. Apparently he was fighting rebels on a battlefield. Chad's interim president, Mohamed Idris Deby, won the May 6th presidential election with 61.3% of the vote. According to preliminary results, the Election Commission said on Thursday. Thus, Deby provisionally scored well above the 50% required to avoid a second round. Success Masra, the main opposition candidate and the country's prime minister, got 18.53% of the votes. A total of 10 candidates were running for the office in the first round, including Debbie and Masra, as well as Albert Pahimi Padake, the nation's former prime minister, and Lidi Biasimda, the only female candidate. After former Chadian President Idriss Déby Itno died in 2021 from wounds received fighting rebels in the north of the country, a transitional military council led by General Mohammed Idriss Déby, the son of the late leader, was created to govern the country. In 2022, the military council was dissolved and Mohammed Idriss Déby was appointed interim president while the transition period was extended until 2024. They didn't even bother with the claims of a disputed election. They didn't even mention that Masra had come out and declared himself the winner. Consider the difference in perspective from these regime propaganda outlets to a Russian-oriented outlet, which may well be propaganda. The point is to understand the difference in perspective and agenda. Anytime the regime has to deal with a presidential winner they don't want, their various propaganda mouthpieces make sure to do everything they can to delegitimize and discredit those leaders. And we can see that effort here on full display. The results say 61-18. Not a close election. And I'm not saying that those results could never be produced through election theft. They could be. And if there is enough narrative control to pull that off and convince the people, or if there is actual military control backing all of it up, maybe they could try to produce results that extreme and convince people that they're real despite them being fake. But you can't pull that off in any country that understands that at worst, the candidates are roughly equal. That would be a failing effort. And we may see that kind of failing effort this fall. Don't get me wrong. I think it's entirely possible that they might tell us Joe Biden received 110 million votes this year. But there's no way they could do that and people wouldn't realize what's happened. And that's the important part. So what do we have? We have a nation that has been systematically impoverished over decades under the rule of a particular family who the regime seems not to like. They killed the ruler. His son replaced him in a transitional government as they were moving back to a constitutional system with open, supposedly free and fair elections, where the member of the ruling family took over for his slain father and ran in an election against the prime minister. The current leader wins by 43 points. That is what's announced. And the global media tries immediately to discredit him and claim that the election might have been stolen, despite never giving that sort of credence to anything Donald Trump ever said, when everyone can see that that election was stolen. The difference is really quite profound. And once you start seeing these things, you can't stop seeing them, because this is how it works. Once you understand the machinations and the messaging that supports them, the layer of the false reality just drops away. And it's like, oh, you're just trying to steal that election. And if you're not able to do it, you're going to destabilize the country and try to delegitimize and discredit the winner and try to impoverish the country so that everyone who knows you're the enemy will eventually relent. And sooner or later, you're going to get your guy in there in control. And then at that point, all the money will flood in so that you can buy off everyone who's just searching for a better life. Over time, you take over the business community. Everybody just lives to serve that constant money flow. You take over the government. You implement the system. You extract all of the resources, and you can continue to do that until all of the people realize what's happening and finally reject it. And then it goes the other direction for a while until the regime is kicked out and the process starts all over again. Meanwhile, the regime just plays this out in different places at different times. So whenever they lose control of one place, they can move to another. You know, like in the mid-1940s when they were like, hey guys, we got to get out of Germany. We should head over to America and South America and the Middle East. And you know what? Maybe we should try this in China. We can see it happening. Hillary Clinton says never again. Yes, you are right. Never again, because we will never believe you again. You will never get that far through the program again because everyone will be able to see what it is. All right. And so I told you we were going to finish the week with some more highbrow panic, some serious panic. This is from yesterday in The Economist. The world's economic order is breaking down. Subheadline, the critics will miss globalization when it's gone. In late April, for the 75th time in a row, America blocked a mundane motion at the World Trade Organization to fill vacancies on the panel that is the final arbiter of disputes among the other group's members. The relentless vetoes, obscure as they might sound, have in effect completely defanged the WTO for almost 5 years. Members that are found to have violated its rules can simply appeal against the decision to a panel that is not functioning for lack of personnel. While the appeals molder, the transgressions go unpunished. 2 years ago, at one of the WTO's biennial summits, members resolved to get the dispute resolution mechanism up and running again by this year. At the latest summit earlier this year, having failed to do so, they instead decided, even without a hint of irony, to quote-unquote accelerate discussions. The dysfunction at the WTO is emblematic of a world where the institutions and rules intended to foster international trade and investment are falling into abeyance. Every day brings alarming new headlines. The European Union, although supposedly both more supportive of free trade and more determined to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions than other economic powers, is on the verge of imposing duties on Chinese electric vehicles. Last month, EU officials raided a big Chinese security equipment maker as part of a probe into subsidies. America recently imposed sanctions on more than 300 entities, including some in China and Turkey, for providing support to Russia's armed forces. Now, The Economist as an outlet is as regime can be. And naturally, they are giving the official story in the old and ridiculous paradigm of believing that each country is just working as a cohesive whole. Obviously, never communicating the hidden good twin, evil twin aspect of all of these things. So America, on one hand, is laying out these sanctions on these economic rivals, but for whatever reason, they just won't allow the appointments of all these members of this World Trade Organization panel. Well, why not? Why would that trend that started under Donald Trump still have continued all of these years under the very real presidency of Joe Biden? Gosh, I wish there was something to explain this sort of thing. Is The Economist going to explain it to us? I mean, there must be an explanation for this within the central narrative, right? Nope, I guess not. America's just holding up these appointments for some reason and gumming up the works of one of these most important global governing bodies. Gosh, how will we convince Joe Biden to do what we want as the real legitimate president of the United States of America? Why won't all the compromise and corruption we have to hold over Joe Biden not work? Well, shucks, I guess we'll just never know. The proliferation of subsidies and sanctions is one of the most obvious signs of the unraveling of the quote-unquote international rules-based order, as policy wonks like to call it. Institutions like the WTO were created to remove barriers to the movement of goods and capital, and so foster trade and investment. This process has gone into reverse, with the obstacles multiplying as the rules fray. This unhappy regression, call it deglobalization, for want of a better term, is beginning to become visible in the economic data as investors reprice assets and redirect capital in a less integrated world. Although these shifts have not yet had much impact on global living standards, they constitute a giant and alarming gamble that the enormous reductions in poverty brought about by globalization can continue without it. And let's pause for a second to consider the picture I just laid out toward the end of our conversation about Chad. And I forgot to mention, by the way, that coincidentally with this result in the election in Chad, the U.S. is now withdrawing all combat forces out of Niger. So that was not the result that the global regime and the American Uniparty wanted in that Chad election. But in the picture I was just describing a few minutes ago, let's consider how they're framing globalization. Globalization is what has taken these various countries out of poverty. The countries were impoverished. We brought in globalization, and now those countries are wealthy. If we take away our globalization, what's going to happen to those countries? I wonder if they could be impoverished again. Really, all you have to do from there is understand that globalism is a result of their control and their influence. Prior to, hopefully right now, anytime a country would withdraw from that one world, liberal, international, rules-based order, that country would become the target of hybrid warfare, information warfare, economic warfare, occasionally military warfare, and somehow, just coincidentally, immigration and climate change. And sometimes, even immigration brought about by climate change. That is not something that we should see as a natural result of shifting economic systems. That's not the natural advantage of globalism going away. That is hybrid warfare being waged by the global regime for the control over these nations that we pretend are somehow sovereign. Back to the article. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the global economy was a Wild West. Many countries imposed big tariffs on goods to build up domestic industry. Capital controls were strict. Governments regularly expropriated assets from foreign owners. It happened at least 260 times to American investors abroad between 1961 and 1975, according to an official report. And I suppose that will probably have to happen again. I wonder where these American investors abroad will be at that time. Maybe it was all those places they told us they would be fleeing to last week, or maybe it's the one place they didn't tell us. General agreement on tariffs. Even when foreign investors were tolerated, they were not given the red carpet treatment. Consider George Cajon, the McDonald's executive who led the effort to set up a branch of the fast food chain in the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 1980s. Foreigners were forbidden from taking money out of the country, making it impossible for the firm to earn a return on its investment. Its only option was to reinvest any profits within the Soviet Union and hope that the rules would change in the future. Getting permission to open was also a slog. This is a hamburger. This is an order of French fries, the late Mr. Cajon recalled having to explain to surly bureaucrats in his memoir. At one point, he was made to wait in a hotel room for 17 days for a contract to be translated and typed up. Gosh, that must have been terrible for Mr. Cajon. Someone's going to have to explain to me what gives the owner of a foreign corporation the right to come into the country and then extract all that wealth right back out. That's not like some immutable moral law. If you don't like the rules of doing business in a country, don't do business in that country. The Economist simply expects its readers to view everything from the perspective of a globalist, that transnational corporations are the ultimate goal of capitalist competition. They are the companies that have risen to the top purely through meritocracy, and because of their greatness, every other country in the world deserves to take part in it too. International monetary freedom. The end of the Cold War, however, helped stitch the global economy together more tightly. A consensus emerged, however fragile and reviled, that it was easier for economies to grow through integration than self-isolation. Tariffs fell sharply. Governments abolished many capital controls, including the ones that prevented McDonald's from taking profits out of what had become Russia. Many countries even surrendered some sovereignty to allow the emerging system to work better. Oh, how about that? They surrendered their sovereignty to allow the emerging global system to work better. Wow. One of the reforms that accompanied the evolution of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade into the WTO in 1995 was the creation of a binding mechanism to resolve trade disputes, the one that America is now sabotaging. Well, by golly, what is Joe Biden thinking, right? Right? Joe Biden, ha. Politicians tried to court foreign investors like Cajon rather than the other way around. This was always an incomplete process, in China in particular, but flows of trade and investment soared. In recent years, cross-border trade and investments have stopped growing. Three big scourges are undermining globalization, the proliferation of punitive economic measures of various sorts, the sudden vogue for industry policy, and the decay of global institutions. The punitive measures do not typically take the form of higher tariffs, although a few big countries, such as America and India, have been raising them. Tariffs remain low by historical standards, and many governments continue to cut them. In Canada and Japan, average tariffs are still falling. Australia recently abolished close to 500 tariffs unilaterally. There is little sign yet of the sort of tit-for-tat escalation that hobbled the world economy in the 1930s. Oh, yes, that's what did it. Various countries using tariffs is what caused everything in the 1930s. Got nothing to do with those global bankers. But the world's governments are imposing trade sanctions more than 4 times as often as they did in the 1990s, according to the Global Sanctions Database, a research outfit. Western governments have put hundreds of sanctions on Russia in retaliation for its invasion of Ukraine. America is placing ever more restrictions on China to thwart its technological ambitions, especially in semiconductors. Another Donald Trump policy, by the way, that the illegitimate Biden regime is now pretending to take responsibility for. Governments are also screening foreign investments more carefully and often barring investments in quote-unquote strategic companies. The number of FDI regimes and regulatory enhancements is growing around the world, particularly in Europe, according to White & Case, a law firm. In America in 2022, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States closely scrutinized 286 proposed deals, up from just 97 in 2013. The British government recently approved the sale of the country's largest chip-making facility to an American firm after blocking a bid from a Chinese-owned entity. A senior Canadian minister has boasted that his government has blocked a number of Chinese bids for mining companies, saying that the move had gone down very well with American authorities. Other countries are going to greater extremes and actually expropriating assets. Earlier this year, Mexico's government ordered the seizure of a hydrogen plant belonging to a French firm. In March, lawmakers in South Africa voted to confiscate land without compensation when it is in the national interest. A year ago, Chile announced plans to expand the government's role in the lithium industry markedly. Russia's defenders complain that Western governments are discussing plans to expropriate Russian assets held abroad and divert the proceeds to help Ukraine. The second big change is the rise of industrial policy. Politicians are frantically competing to build up domestic supply chains and local industries, not in coal and steel, as in the post-war period, but in clean energy, electric vehicles, and computer chips. By one count, governments around the world adopted over 1,500 policies to promote specific industries in both 2021 and 2022, compared with almost none in the early 2010s. On the fiscal side, America is funneling billions of dollars to favored firms to boost production of clean energy and computer chips. Last month, TSMC, a chip maker that has been promised vast state funding, announced that construction of a big new plant in Arizona was on track. Well-funded schemes to boost domestic manufacturing include Made in Europe, Make in India, a future Made in Australia. Canada's government dubbed last year's budget its Made in Canada plan. It is in subsidies rather than tariffs that a tit-for-tat escalation is occurring. A new paper published by the IMF finds a 74% probability that a subsidy for a given product in a big economy is met with a subsidy for the same product from another big economy within a year. Now, again, this is portrayed as some natural result from economic processes. That's not what this is. Governments intend to subsidize things that help push the global regime's agenda forward. The global regime is pushing the same agenda forward everywhere, so you would expect if one government subsidizes a given company or a given industry, the governments of other countries implementing the same agenda would be doing the same thing. It's not because it's wise economic policy. It's because it incentivizes the same agenda in all the countries where they're implementing it. This isn't complicated economic stuff. It's the most obvious result ever of the program they're implementing once they take over world governments. The third change relates to global institutions, which are a shadow of their former selves. The IMF used to have almost exclusive power to resolve poor countries' debt problems. But with the rise of alternative creditors such as China and India, it is finding that job more difficult. Each part of a debt restructuring, including steps that were once formalities, are often now subject to protracted negotiations. A growing number of countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, are nearly or already unable to service their debts. Yet resolving such crises is proving almost impossible. Damn, that would include all of those countries in the Sahel. The IMF has also changed from within. The organization, chastened by widespread complaints that its policy prescriptions were too harsh in the 1980s and 1990s, now devotes growing attention to questions of climate change and inequality at the expense of its overarching mission of instilling sound macroeconomic management. In the latest edition of its flagship annual publication, The World Economic Outlook, the word reform appears 63 times, compared with 171 times in the edition of 30 years ago. And let's just read one of those sentences again, because it sounds like they just called the IMF retarded. And the IMF is like their best friend. The organization, chastened by widespread complaints that its policy prescriptions were too harsh in the 80s and 90s, now devotes growing attention to questions of climate change and inequality at the expense of its overarching mission of instilling sound macroeconomic management. Yeah, they called them retarded. That's crazy. The most moribund multilateral institution, however, is the WTO. Since the collapse of a 14-year-long negotiation in 2015, all talk of expanding free trade or deepening protections for it has fallen by the wayside. This year's summit only just managed to extend a moratorium that, had it lapsed, could have seen countries imposing tariffs on cross-border transfers of data, including software and music. And I would suspect, by the way, that you can count on that as part of the future. And that will also be a substantial aspect of blocking foreign propaganda and interference. It will also have a deterrent aspect to globalism itself, because as with the production of anything else, if you impose tariffs on importers, you encourage the purchase of that which is produced domestically, which means the cultural creation in America will come from Americans. I really think I might end up finding myself in a rabbit hole on that this weekend. With the appeals process frozen, governments can adopt capricious policies with little fear of censure. In the past year, an index of quote-unquote trade policy uncertainty produced by economists at the Federal Reserve has been nearly twice as high as the long-run average. World trade ostracization. The effect of these three scourges are predictably grim. An index that tracks references to economic uncertainty in prominent publications is at twice its average level from 1997 to 2015. Not only has global trade in goods stagnated, the same problem now afflicts services too. Cross-border investment is in retreat as well as a share of global GDP. Both long-term, direct, and short-term portfolio flows are well below their peaks. Companies are retrenching to avoid geopolitical rifts in particular. The share of American corporate profits coming from abroad is falling fast. Western law firms and banks are pulling out of China. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, McDonald's quit the Russian market. A new Russian-owned restaurant, Delicious Full Stop, has taken over many of the American chain's outlets. As if to bear out Cajon's proselytizing about the benefits of globalization, the new restaurant has received poor reviews. Oh, I'm sure they're devastated in Russia. The regime has probably been review bombing on whatever Russia's version of Yelp is, and now The Economist is letting us know that the McDonald's replacement isn't quite as good as McDonald's. McDonald's isn't as good as McDonald's. You can basically say that at any time in the future, and it will be true. Like right now, I could say McDonald's isn't as good as McDonald's, and it would be true of 30 seconds ago. McDonald's just keeps getting progressively worse forever. It's incredible. Back to The Economist. Those investors still willing to venture abroad expect a higher rate of return. The Economist analyzed data published by the Federal Reserve on stocks and flows of cross-border investment. For years, the gap between American investors' returns abroad and that on risk-free treasury bonds was shrinking, suggesting that the world was becoming a safer place. But in recent years, the gap has widened again, pointing to growing global instability. Another sign of deglobalization comes from relative prices, how similar prices are for the goods and services in different places. In a seamless market, variation should be small, as firms and consumers seek out the best deals, and incomes in poorer areas catch up with richer ones. Before the pandemic, average prices in Britain's costliest region were only about 10% higher than in its cheapest, for instance. And that sounds like something that could probably only happen with some level of price control and manipulation. It's not like prices in the richer neighborhoods are going down and equalizing lower. It's that everything else is getting more expensive. For years, the variation in relative prices around the world was declining, signaling a convergence. But in recent years, progress has stopped or even gone into reverse. Admittedly, economists' dream of a single global market was always a distant prospect. Some services are hard to trade. A lawyer or barber in Rome will struggle to attract customers from Auckland, meaning that prices are unlikely to ever converge fully. But growing global variation suggests that the world economy is atomizing rather than integrating. So it is decentralizing rather than centralizing. And isn't it amazing that they are indicating their preference for price convergence worldwide? What would that be? How could that emerge? Oh, yes, global communism. Like I've been saying since 2020, all the time, while people tell me you can't even define communism. That is what they always say. And they say that because they can't define communism. They don't understand the concept at all. They just know that they are smart and people like us are not. The reduced efficiency that this entails does not seem to bother the many politicians who are embracing deglobalization. Damn, what are they going to do without perfect efficiency? Oh no, the trains, they don't run on time. You have to love these lunatics. They're like, no, this is the best, most efficient way to control everything. As if everyone shares their priority and they are actually popular in some democratic sense. So far, the economic damage has been limited. Last year, global GDP grew by a respectable 3%. Some of the countries that have embraced isolationism most enthusiastically, including America and India, are growing especially quickly. That has prompted some to argue that deglobalization will actually boost growth. They just said Donald Trump's policies are working. And what allowed them to do that? The fact that Joe Biden didn't take away Donald Trump's policies on behalf of the global regime that owns his compromise and has been the beneficiary of Joe Biden's corruption. But the fake president, Joe Biden, just leaves all those policies in place because he knows they're good for the American economy long term, and he's just looking out for the people as a real, legitimate president should. Back to The Economist, reacting to the argument that some people make, asserting that deglobalization might actually work and be good. The Economist writes, that seems improbable. The golden age of globalization caused an unprecedented decline in global poverty. The number of Chinese living in extreme deprivation, for instance, has fallen from 800 million to almost zero. Starting around 1990, developing economies began to grow more rapidly and catch up to the higher income levels enjoyed by advanced economies, says Douglas Irwin of Dartmouth College. Research published in March suggests that inequality within countries has declined too. Moving away from global integration thus presents a massive risk to the world's poor in particular. How about that? The Economist, a propaganda mouthpiece for the world's most wealthy and powerful people, is primarily concerned that their system is going away and it's really going to hurt the poor. That's what it is. They're just so charitable. This is how the article concludes. Nonetheless, politicians appear wedded to deglobalization, which they see as a means to secure a slice of the, quote, industries of the future. Narendra Modi, who is about to be re-elected as India's prime minister, is spending vast sums on a, quote unquote, production-linked incentives scheme to boost its share of global manufacturing. China's leaders, meanwhile, are spending a fortune to strengthen their country's position as the global leader in clean energy and electric vehicles. Donald Trump, who may win a second term as America's president in November, is mulling a 60% tariff on all Chinese goods. He may well revive an old threat to quit the WTO altogether. Joe Biden, the incumbent, is only slightly better. He is convinced that subsidies can turn a services-dominated economy back into a manufacturing powerhouse. The EU, for its part, wants the WTO to allow space for industrial policy in future trade deals. At the same time, tensions between the West and China make economic warfare ever more likely, even as they reduce the chance of meaningful reform to global institutions. As deglobalization gathers pace, its true costs are likely to become clear. So we started with the lowbrow panic, just the natural, visceral response of these people who thought that they were prominent and powerful. They really knew what was going on. They were thought leaders. They were leading the conversation. People listened to them and respected them. And now they're all realizing they just don't matter. They have no idea what's going on, but people don't listen to them. In fact, they just mock them. These people have no credibility left whatsoever, and they are starting to come to terms with that because even the fake news they're producing is bad news for them. They are accepting future losses that people don't even understand will happen, and they are moving toward goals further out in the future and trying to lay the groundwork to achieve those goals. But even that process is failing, and it's of the utmost importance that we make sure that fails. And then we have the highbrow panic. The fact that the regime is being summarily removed from all of these countries that it has controlled for decades or centuries. And not only is their control being removed, but their system is being removed as well. They are describing it in every minute detail, letting us know exactly where it's breaking down. And I suppose from the perspective of wealthy globalists, maybe this would read as a call to arms, something to inspire them to get back in the game and use their influence however they can. Put their money wherever it's needed in order to avoid this problem. But there's no avoiding it. It's already gone. If they thought they were going to get anything out of Joe Biden, it didn't work. This is the MAGA agenda that is still being implemented. Deglobalization is the goal. It is a worldwide decentralization away from the global regime's liberal, international, rules-based order. We in the United States always believe that we are exceptional. We have been told we are the freest, wealthiest, most powerful country in the history of the world by the same people who told us that masks worked and Joe Biden received 81 million real lawful American votes. But we're not that different. From their perspective, we are a slave colony with a global police force who produces a lot of high-quality entertainment. They run the same program here that they run everywhere else, and we fall for it probably harder than they do everywhere else because they keep telling us we have it the best. And they show us these impoverished countries and say, well, you don't want to be that. But another system is emerging, and their incentive and punishment structure is breaking down. There is nothing that can prevent that. There is nothing that can reverse that. All we need to do is make sure that their dramatic events are never able to get everyone back on the same page, which is their page. And if we do that, they can't even pull off a civil war. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. I will be back on Monday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under a quarter per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree, linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's